So now that we've created our burst wave weapon, we are capable of distributing a wave of projectiles while respecting our fire interval as well as the pattern distribution, meaning that we can't cut things short. So we're almost there. We're just one final step away from being able to create a fully automatic burst wave weapon, and that's what we're going to do in this video. Now, we've all seen that with a weapon's primary goal is to simply fire. And when a weapon fires, what does it do? In the end, it calls upon the ship's fire action. So that's the big picture, if you will. What if we were able to take advantage of the flexibility that's in place with our weapon system such that we had one weapon fire another weapon? Now, why would that even be beneficial to us? Well, we've already established, so here we are with a weapon. We've already established an automatic weapon. So here we are with auto. So with an automatic weapon, we now have a timer in place that handles the call to fire, which then goes through to the ship's fire action. What if we were to extend auto one more time to some other kind of weapon that held a reference to another weapon so that we could create a scenario like this? Let's say that here we're reaching through to our ship, right? What if we created a scenario that looked like this? A weapon that reached through and hit the fire button for another weapon which reached through to fire action on the ship, which basically invoked fire action. How about something like that? And in order to pull that off, to have a reference, of course, this guy, we're going to store that reference in the weapon itself, meaning this weapon. So we could have a weapon that held a field to another weapon. And that's what we're going to take a look at doing. So we're going to take the characteristics of a fully automatic weapon and extend those just a little bit further such that we're able to hold a reference to another weapon. So we'll call this something like auto burst. Now you might be thinking, well, couldn't we just call it auto weapon? But that doesn't make a lot of sense. We already have a class that handles making a weapon fully automatic. So if we were to extend that into a weapon auto weapon, if you will, the problem I see with that would be, why would you want to create an automatic weapon and then shove that into the reference of the automatic weapon automatic? That wouldn't make a lot of sense, though we can talk about that a little bit more at the very end. In this particular case, we are looking to automate a burst weapon, and so we will do that through the creation of the auto burst weapon. But again, this guy in this constructor, he's going to be looking for a weapon to be coming in because we need to store that reference to a weapon. Then we could just simply turn around and override fire, because the normal behavior of fire established all the way back up in the weapon class is to simply call through to the ship's fire action delegate. Well, if we override that down here and we tell this guy, look, what we want you to do, instead of calling on the regular ship's fire, is to reach through to the referenced weapon that you have and call his fire. Then that weapon, well, it would just do what it's supposed to do, reach through to the ship and trigger the fire action. So that's what we're going to put in place. Logan, let me go ahead and turn it on over to you.
All right, let's switch back over into Visual Studio, and let's get started. From what we've learned on the whiteboard, we know that we're going to need a class that extends weapon auto that contains another weapon. So let's begin with that idea. Let's go up to Game. We'll add in a new item, and this will be our weapon auto burst. Inside of weapon auto burst, we'll begin by cleaning up the sub namespace, and then we'll make sure that weapon auto burst extends weapon auto. Now, of course, inside of this class, we know that we're going to need our internal reference to a sub-weapon, and we're going to make this reference be of type weapon burst. So we're going to be containing a burst weapon. Internally, we'll refer to this as simply weapon. Now we're going to establish the public constructor for weapon auto burst, and we need to make sure we take in enough parameters to satisfy the constructor for a weapon auto. So let's get started on the constructor. The public constructor for weapon auto burst is going to take in a ship. It's going to take in a double parameter for fire interval. and it will take in a weapon burst, and this is where that linkage will actually be established. It's in the constructor. So we'll take in a weapon burst, which we're going to call weapon burst for the parameter name. Now I'll jump down to a new line so we can make our call to the base constructor, where we'll pass along the ship parameter and the fire interval parameter. Then inside of the constructor body, we'll establish the link between the weapon field in this.weapon to the incoming weapon burst parameter. Alright, now that this is set up, we're actually very close on this weapon auto burst.
We really are, because we got a lot of functionality that we're already getting from weapon auto.
Exactly, and once again, his purpose is for this weapon auto burst to pull the trigger of the contained burst weapon. And where we're going to do that from is actually from the fire method, because think about it like this. Knowing how an automatic weapon works, that is, after start fire is called, after the fire button is pressed, the fire method is called continuously as long as the weapon is still firing. And it's those continuous pulses that we want to use to drive the burst weapon. So this is why we're going to be overriding the fire method, and not the equals method. Override to fire. And let me just because I'm lazy, let me pull that back up, and we'll do an override to fire. Now, note that I am going to wipe out the call to base.fire, and here in a minute we'll explain exactly why. We'll wipe this call out and replace it with a call to this.weapon.startFire. And that is it for the class. I can build, make sure that there's no errors, but that's it. Now you might be wondering, well, what about things like calls to start fire, possibly calls to stop fire? Why are we only using the protected method instead of what is actually linked up to the fire button? For this, keep in mind how the weapon auto is working and the fact that we're actually leveraging a little bit of functionality that already exists. I can point that out if we open up the weapon auto class. Remember that weapon auto is, of course, driven by using a timer, so we're leveraging some timer functionality that already exists and is linked up to this timer fire method. So that is really the heart of the automatic weapon, is that a timer calls fire continuously. But we gain one other advantage, and that is the fact that the weapon auto also makes an initial call to fire, and that's what gives us our instant response. You'll note one final thing, in that there is no override to fire. There's no additional fire code in weapon auto itself. So to get the final idea of why we took fire and made sure that there was no call to base, well, what was that call to base? Over here in weapon auto, there is no override to fire. If we go all the way back to the base weapon, we can see that its fire method is originally defined as having a call to the ship's fire action. So this establishes the default behavior of all weapons invoking a fire action. Now in the case of the weapon auto burst, we specifically wanted to change this. We don't want the weapon auto burst itself causing projectiles to spawn or causing any other kind of fire action. We want it to only pull the trigger of its contained weapon. So that is why we don't have the call to base back here in weapon auto burst. So again, very simple class, and it really does allow us to take the automatic functionality on one hand of the weapon auto, combine that with the burst fire functionality of the weapon burst class, and is kept generic enough so that any weapon burst can be passed in.
That's right.
And one final thing to point out here is, seeing as how we have in fact made this more generic than burst wave, we have not locked this into the wave variant of burst, we allow any burst variant.
That's right.
So you might be thinking to yourself, well, why not make something like a weapon auto weapon and just make this a stock weapon and then have any future kind of weapon you haven't invented yet usable? The reason I would be cautious in doing that is because that's a very big unknown. You don't know what the nature of that new weapon might be, meaning you don't know what kinds of start fire and stop fire calls. For example, this weapon auto is actually going to be calling start fire over and over again on the burst weapon and isn't going to be calling stop fire at all. But because we know what a weapon burst is, we know that that's not going to affect it. We know that weapon burst isn't even using stop fire, and calling start fire over and over again is not a problem. We have even proven that calling start fire every single tick will not actually affect the behavior of the burst weapon. So we know that this code is solid. Now, if you would like to make a very generic version of weapon auto weapon, you're of course free to do so. Just keep in mind that if used in conjunction with the weapon auto, there are going to be more calls to start fire, and unless you put a specific pass-through, no calls to stop fire.
Exactly, and I'm just going to jump back to what I said at the very beginning. Having a weapon driving an auto weapon is kind of odd.
Exactly. So that would mean you'd want to sit down and think for a second, is there a really good reason that that weapon scenario you're thinking of can't simply be a weapon auto?
Exactly.
But now that we've got this in place, it's time to try it out and see if this finally has our solution 100% in place. We're going to jump over now to the player ship class, and inside of player ship, we're going to make some changes to our ship's weapon. The first thing we're going to do is point out the fact that to use this new weapon scenario, we do at some point need to instantiate 2 weapons instead of 1, because that weapon auto burst takes in a weapon, it doesn't make one on its own. Now, in order to establish the burst weapon, well, what kind of burst weapon is it that we want for the player ship? Well, it's a weapon burst wave. We're already making one of those, so I'm going to change this line very slightly. Instead of assigning that to our field, I'm going to assign it to a local variable. I'll make a weapon burst variable that I'll simply call burst weapon. So we have a burst weapon that is not yet assigned to the ship. Now to the ship, that is this dot weapon, we're going to assign a new weapon auto burst. Weapon auto burst is going to need to take in reference to ship. We can pass in this. Now, let's think about this for a second. What should the interval be for this weapon auto burst? Well, we want an interval that will recall the fire on our burst weapon as many times as necessary, as quickly as necessary, but not too quickly, just for efficiency's sake. So how quickly should we call it? Well, ideally, we would want to recall the fire for our burst weapon as soon as an entire burst of projectiles has finished. So how much time is that? Well, if we look at the individual step-by-step firing interval, that would be given by wave fire interval. We also know how many steps are in the overall wave, so if we multiplied these two together, we would get a longer interval, which would represent the entire burst. So I'm going to copy both of those, paste them in, and make sure that they are multiplied against each other. And that gives us our interval for our weapon auto burst. Now, of course, the last parameter is a reference to an actual burst weapon. We'll put in the burst weapon variable, and that wraps up the call to the constructor and gives us a new weapon auto burst assigned to our ship's weapon. So let's build and run the game, and we can test things out. If we hold the fire button down, we now see that we have our wave fire based weapon working, and it is fully automatic. I don't have to press the button over and over again. And one final check, just to make sure that we still meet all requirements, and that is that we don't exceed the fire interval, and that we don't interrupt the sequence. Let me try things like just letting up on the fire button a few times, and we see that we're always getting complete waves, even if I just tap the button very briefly. Also, if we go into the player class, and we re-enable our stress test way down in process input, we can see that even a call to fire every single tick does not interfere with this new weapon. We simply get an automatic firing, but we have the proper sequence, and we're firing complete waves of projectiles.
Outstanding.
So I believe with that, we have set up a working solution. So we can call the solution 2 is now fully in effect and is doing its job. We have created the wave firing solution that we would like. That means that this original solution over here in weapon auto wave is no longer needed. We now have a much more enhanced version of it, so we are free to completely delete it, as it now does the same task, just not as well. So let's build one last time, make sure that there's no empty references, and everything is working just fine.
Excellent. Okay, I believe that's pretty much going to, well, it's going to wrap up our weapon system framework. I was looking for the right word in my head, having a hard time coming up with it, but we've pretty much got our framework established, and we've got a few weapons that we can now use. We're going to come back to weapons in a little while, where we will take a look at some sidearms and some missiles and things like that. But I think it's time for us to now turn our attention over to enemies for a little while and see if we can give some enemies a little bit of life so that they can move around the screen and let them try out our weapons and see what they think. So that is going to conclude this video. Thanks a lot.